The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Debates Don't Work Anymore. They also might not work any less. Old joke, but, I don't know how else to address it. You know what else doesn't work anymore? Science. Neither of those statements are true, and yet they feel true. There's something about them. Somebody reached out to me recently and said, hey, they heard some atheist was talking about, the debates are useless and blah, blah, blah. And I understand the mentality, and I understand that the way things appear to be going, it might seem that way. But the methods and processes of both debates and science are exactly as reliable as ever, but there are more vocal objectors and rejectors. And it just seems like those methods, debates and science, everything else, are less efficient or less useful because so much attention is spent on outliers and deniers and doubt and misinformation and the opinions of the uninformed and the underinformed. Welcome to Conspiracy Theory Laden 2025. I put a date in here so that if you watch this years into the future and it's better or worse, you can reach out and let me know whether any of this stood up, whether we fixed any of the problems, whether I was wrong about some of it. Because in my view, the problem isn't with debates or the science, and it's really not even with science communication or the manner in which we have debates. These are tools that we use to get information out. Once upon a time, it was a sort of intellectual exercise. So debates were much less viewed and much less significant, perhaps. You would have grand debates that were pretty rare amongst, famous luminaries on different sides of positions. And, you would have back and forth written debates in newspapers. These were scholarly exercises. It was an intellectual exercise. And so the portion of the population that gave a damn about those things and understood it at that intellectual level was probably moderately small. But now it's entertainment. Now it's viewed as sport. It's theater. Debating has always been theater. This is why you have to be careful about propaganda and the cult of personality surrounding debates. It was always theater and performance, but it wasn't as dishonest, and we didn't try to compare all claims as if they were on the same foundation. You weren't going to have a lot of scholarly debates in a span of time about flat earth, about anti-vaccination. You would have bigger debates on theological questions about whether or not there's a God, because these are things that may be untestable or at least dubious. You can't hold up the litmus test and show. And so it becomes, oh, well, that's not quite right. And so there's this sophistry and dance that goes on in the realm of certain philosophical and spiritual views. It was always theater. And science has the same problem. Not that it's theater, but science communication in the modern world has repeatedly failed. That's why we have a rise in flat earthers and anti-vaxxers and all kinds of things. The world seems to value truth less than it used to. I'm not convinced that it does. I think part of it is we have, because of the internet and because of the 24-hour news cycle, and the prevalence of social media where everybody's participating, we've taken it from, hey, here's a doctor who says, to here's a person in a lab coat who says, to here's someone who says, and I can't make heads or tails of it. Let's just put them all on equal footing and wait until we have a definitive answer. And yet, many times when we have what seems to be as close to a definitive answer as anyone's likely to get, that doesn't change whether or not they're likely to just cheer for their team or maintain the view they have. We know, for example, that if someone makes a public profession of a position or belief, that they are less likely to change their mind and more likely to double down in the face of strong evidence to the contrary, because of the psychology of being fearful, of being exposed as delusional, or admitting to a mistake. I watched a video clip today that I don't know the exact origin, but I did see what I think was Triumph the Insult Comic Dogs. It was probably something put together for a comedy show, but they basically played like a prank on a bunch of Trump supporters. And they said, hey, we've got some old footage that's about to hit the news of Trump from years ago. And we want to get out in front of this. So we'd like for you guys to tell us your thoughts about this so we know how best to respond and what the public concerns are going to be. And they played the first video. It's a bit of an audio clip of what to my ear was an obviously fake. It was a Trump impression and not Trump. And the panel of Trump supporters were asked to deal with that clip. And the content of the first bit was Trump asking someone to install cameras, including in the dressing room and in the floor so that he could look up skirts, essentially. And he used some racially insensitive names and said that, you know, if any of the women tried to sue him, he knows that he can, you know, countersue them or challenge them legally, etc. And it was like 15 years ago, I think almost everybody would have just said, that's absurd, that can't happen. But somehow, because they know that this is at least consistent with things that he has clearly said, or seem to overlap with things that he has clearly said, it's not outlandish that this recording that the public hasn't heard yet might be a broader take on that subject. And they couldn't recognize that it was a Trump impression. And so when asked about that, the responses were, hey, males do that kind of stuff. It's okay. He says what he thinks, and that's what we like about him. And this came from both men and women in the room. The second clip was supposedly from Larry King Live, and it was a cutaway from the show that was supposedly audio of Larry and Trump talking privately during a commercial break. And Trump was saying, or the Trump impression was saying, that he just got done doing a paternity test so he could find out if Ivanka was really his daughter, because she's hot and he heard that she was good in bed. And it ended with, does oral count as incest? I shit you not. The initial response from one of the dudes was, well, he was complimenting his daughter. Do you see why I worry about is this real? How can this be? It's easy to say these people are in a cult because in some sense they are, but these people couldn't tell that the audio recordings were fake. And instead of, even going down that route, they just pasted it together with what they already knew and tried to rationalize it. If instead, imagine that same group of people had been brought in to say, we've got this hidden audio from President Biden, and we're trying to figure out what the right will think of it and what sort of response they're going to get. And we're trying to figure out exactly how we should release it. And they played pretty much the same audio clips, maybe changed it a little bit, like since they like to go after Biden for being supposedly creepy and smelling kids' hair or whatever. Maybe they did something like that and expanded it to something bigger. Do you think those people would have had the same response? Because I don't. See, what separates me from them is that I would be outraged by those statements no matter who made them. What separates me from them is I'm also better at spotting the fakes, but we're entering a world where that's getting harder and harder, where AI, deep fake, large language model stuff is going to make it incredibly difficult for the average person, let alone people who are trained in this stuff, to be able to sort the difference. I don't have a team. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a secular humanist. I'm a skeptic. I'm an atheist. But even those aren't my teams. If there's a secular humanist or a skeptic or an atheist who is an absolutely harmful garbage thinker that is spreading misinformation, I will call them out. I have called them out. Release the Epstein files, no matter who's in there. The people who care about truth and care about people do not care if the person hurting people is ostensibly on their side or not. Look at Al Franken. Full disclosure, I like Al. I've never met him personally. I think he was good both in a comedy sense, and I think he was good as a senator. But he stepped down from his seat with an admission and integrity over a clearly sexist, unfunny joke that he had made years before. It didn't hurt anybody. It had been ignored for a long period of time, but he didn't try to lie or dissemble. He did something that he had to recognize was inappropriate, and he took accountability. The problem is, he's one of the only ones. And so it's the good people who incidentally or thoughtlessly do something that is problematic who are going to own up to it. And the other people aren't going to own up to anything, whether it's murder or sex trafficking. There's just no accountability for some folks. There's only, this is my team, rah, 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 and then they'll believe whatever lies that are involved. And that's why some call it a cult. There's an old adage that cult is what the big church calls the little church, and that's kind of true. It's what the normatively delusional call the excessively delusional, is perhaps more correct. And it's easy to go down that route because if it's about truth, your ability to detect it and whether you care about it is what the focus is. And debates may not have much hope of getting to that point, which is why so many of my debate opponents are frustrated and come lashing out by the fact that I don't show up to defend there is no God, but instead there isn't good reason to believe in a God. Because that's the most accurate model. And they talk, oh, it's the Dillahunty Dodge. And what they're really saying is it's unacceptable to say, I don't know, and I'm not convinced that you do either. Despite the fact that that is probably the most correct, honest, and responsible answer. It's just not as appealing as I know that I know that I know that I know that Jesus Christ is Lord. Confidence is appealing. There's a reason that flat earthers stick to their ideology, their view that it's all a conspiracy to hide the true nature of the earth. Why? Well, for those who are perhaps religious, it might have something to do with the earth coming from God, but basically it comes down to the earth is unique, it's special. It's not like any other stellar body we've ever observed, and that also makes them special because they're special beings on this special place, and they've discovered the special truth that they don't want you to know. Why are they hiding it? I don't know. I don't know if there's any good reason to think so, but here we go. People want comfort. And when truth doesn't get you there, they'll take a comforting lie or delusion. And that goes for pretty much everybody. We all tell ourselves stories. We are all going to be mistaken on things. One of the issues is, what do you do when you have good reason to think that you might be mistaken about something, that you might be delusional about something? There's a couple of different types of people, and some of them are going to look for a way to find out. This is one of the reasons why on the shows I frequently ask people, do you care more about whether your beliefs are true or whether they're comforting? Debates don't work, except when they do. Except when you engage with honest interlocutors who are on a reasonable footing with regard to the ability to have a conversation and address the subjects and communicate them in a way that people can actually understand, where you're not talking over everybody's head all the time. You're not throwing out jargon. You're not, well, so-and-so says, and here's a study, and here's a study, and so-and-so, and this is a study. Instead, just talking and presenting good reasons and exposing bad reasons. Because my position is not there are no gods. My position is I've not been presented with any good reason to believe there's a God. And this is despite 20 years of doing this as a, essentially a professional, and the thousands of years prior. They have nothing to go on. Why is it now in 2025 that not only are we still debating whether or not there's a God, but that the debates are getting worse? You'll see me have great conversations with callers and debate opponents who are honest interlocutors. I think there's a number of debates that I've done, both public debates like the resurrection debate against Theon Christopoulos. There are callers where we've had good conversations where we left still disagreeing, but nobody got heated because we were actually able to have a discussion on some parity of understanding of the subjects, or at least a parity of honesty, caring about whether or not something's true. And you've seen terrible conversations because the interlocutor was dishonest. They either can't or won't recognize or admit their fallacies, even when you draw them a diagram. There is too much information and too much misinformation available to everyone all day for anyone to have a good chance of keeping up. For those who weren't taught how and why to value scientific methods, it's difficult. Science is just, well, it's all Greek to me. Somebody said something, I'll go with it until it conflicts with something else I heard or something else I think, or I just don't like it. They weren't taught how or why to value science. And they also weren't taught how or why to value truth over comfort. That one's even more difficult because comfort is an essential human need. But what other tools do you have? To the extent that debating doesn't seem to be as effective as perhaps it might have been, I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case, because I think there are more people offering more views about those debates. I think if you went back and polled about debates 25, 35, 45, 55, 100 years ago, I bet you'd find that the breakdown, if you expose them to the same percentage of the population, would be roughly similar between people not understanding, not accepting, or rejecting. But because it used to be a niche market, you had people who were on at least more even footing. But if you think about it from a political standpoint, we used to have that same sort of interaction between political parties where everybody wanted a better world. We didn't necessarily agree on how to get there, but we kind of maybe agreed on, at least on what some of it looked like. And the areas where we disagreed, it was more about, hey, let's just not instantiate that stuff as government policy. But the same problems that debate has, science communication also has, because science communication is a part of debate. Science isn't done by debate. I'm not saying science and debate are on the same footing at all. Debating is about presenting the ideas in the same way that scientific communication is about presenting and teaching the science. But if you don't trust the source and you don't understand anything about it, it's just somebody saying something. But what other tool do you have? If you remove the spectacle of the theater and the sport from it all and distill debate down to the details, strengthened by statistics and science, that's the most reliable path to convincing people of a model. Because all you're doing is saying, here's a particular view of something about the world. Here are the facts and information that we have. Here is the data that supports this particular model. Here's why you should accept it. We've tried selling the truth. But supply and demand seems a little screwy in the modern world. The truth is harder to find because there's more information and more misinformation readily available. And the truth is less desirable. And that fact is going to kill us. So what better tools do we have besides debate and science? Seems like we have to keep using debates, try to make them better. And of course, we're going to continue to rely on science because science is the single most consistently reliable way to understand reality. It's not a proclamation of truth. It's not a proclamation of certainty or knowledge. But we desperately need to fix our education system so that science is back on top and debate is once again respected because it's respectable and not because it is spectacle. And that dogma and superstition are shameful things to value. And that we encourage people to know that they can do better and be better on those subjects. And that acknowledging that you were wrong or that you don't know is not at all diminishing for your character. It is instead a representation that you actually care about truth, honesty, integrity, and that you're willing to acknowledge when you got it wrong, when you didn't know, when you were hyperbolic. Trump outlawed flag burning just the other day. He actually didn't, but we'll see. And I went live on this channel as a veteran to talk about it. Another veteran went out and lit a flag on fire and was arrested. And some people said, oh, he was arrested for burning a flag. And while that's technically true, he was arrested for setting a flag on fire. The charge wasn't flag burning. The charge was essentially lighting fire to something in a public park. And so in some arguments where people were like, oh, he was arrested for this new flag burning, blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, technically he was arrested for this other thing. And I was hoping they'd say, yes, but it means this. And I would have been, yes, absolutely. Technically he was arrested for starting a fire in a park. Is lighting a cigarette in that park considered lighting a fire? I don't know. I don't know what the language is. How many other people have been arrested for starting a fire in the park? Can we look at the statistics on that and under what circumstances? Because that's the way you peel back the veil, by acknowledging that this was not declared as an application or an implementation of Trump's new executive order, but it was this other thing that actually probably almost certainly occurred because of that executive order. There's a difference between the cause and the charge, the act and what they're going to say you did wrong. Like public disturbance, disorderly conduct, attempt to incite a riot. Those are the things you get charged with. And it's important when we're up against the people who lie or exaggerate that we strive a little harder to both point out the correct facts about the situation and point out why that's essentially just as bad, or why it's window dressing, why it's reasonable to conclude that this vet was arrested for this. But as it turns out, I tried having that conversation more than once to make sure that we weren't out there. I don't want to give the other side ammunition of, look at these lefty lunatics. They can't stop lying. They can't stop exaggerating. They're going to make that accusation anyway, but at least we would have the benefit of saying, no, here's the truth. We're willing to acknowledge he was not arrested for flag burning under that, but he lit fire to a flag and they charged him with something else. Why? How often does that happen? We could debate it, and I'm sure there'll be lots of debates about this and many other things, because all debating is trying to make a persuasive representation of a position that you want to defend. What other option is there? It doesn't have to be a formal, structured, moderated debate with slides. It's all debating. You're making your case, I'm going to make mine. Maybe my case is that you're wrong. Maybe my case is that we have no reason to think you're right. But those are distinct views. And it's worth, in my view, not exaggerating, not lying, making sure that humility and accuracy are on our side so that there's less holes, fewer holes, there we go, fewer holes in our ideas, because none of us have got perfect ideas. None of us have got perfect positions. But the more weak our ground is, the more holes there are, the more they're able to just poke and say, look at there. We see this in science all the time. When the science behind evolution became robust enough that it was just accepted, the narrative got shifted to, well, were you there? Because if you weren't there, that's kind of like, that's kind of reasonable doubt there. Yeah, that's what it is reasonable doubt, blah, 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 blah. So debates don't work except when they do. Science communication doesn't work except when it does. We have an education problem. We have an information problem. And it looks like both of those are going to get worse for a while, given what they've done to the Department of Education in the United States. I'm optimistic that maybe other countries won't follow suit, so there may still be places in this world where you can get a good education and you can be lifted up to understand the value of honesty and integrity and valuing truth over comfort. Because when you realize and when you dedicate yourself to valuing truth over comfort, it's incredibly comforting. See you next time.